The shovel struck something hard beneath the dark soil, and the sound rang out across the empty field like a bell tolling in a forgotten church. Garrett Thorne paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his gloved hand, and stared down at the patch of earth he had been turning for the better part of the morning. The sky above Seattle hung low and gray, typical for early spring in 2024, and the air carried that peculiar weight that comes before rain. He had been working this land for only 3 months, having purchased the property at auction after the previous owner passed away without heirs, and already he had unearthed more than his share of surprises. Rusted farm equipment, shards of pottery, even a child's bicycle frame so corroded it crumbled at his touch. But this was different. The sound was too deliberate, too solid. He knelt down and began clearing the soil with his hands, pushing aside the loose earth until his fingers found the edge of something smooth and hard. Synthetic material, he thought, not metal, not wood. He worked carefully, methodically, revealing first a corner, then a side, then finally the entire length of what appeared to be a suitcase. It was old, that much was certain. The once vibrant blue fabric faded to a mottled gray and streaked with rust from the metal frame that held it together. The zipper was seized shut with corrosion, and the handle had rotted away to nothing. Garrett sat back on his heels and studied it for a long moment, feeling an inexplicable chill run through him despite the mild temperature. He carried the suitcase back to his farmhouse, a modest structure that had seen better days but which he was slowly restoring to livability. Inside, he laid it on the kitchen table beneath the yellow glow of an overhead lamp and examined it more closely. There was a tag attached to the handle, or what remained of the handle, dangling by a thin leather strap that had somehow survived the years underground. The tag was plastic, the kind airlines used decades ago, and though the writing had faded considerably, he could still make out a name printed in neat block letters, Jessica Morrow. The name meant nothing to him. He pulled out his phone and ran a search, combining the name with Seattle and missing persons. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. Jessica Morrow had disappeared in 1998, vanished without a trace from the city of Millbrook, nearly 200 miles to the south. She had been 23 years old, a graduate student studying environmental science, last seen leaving her apartment on a Thursday evening in late October. The case had garnered local attention at the time, her photograph appearing in newspapers and on television broadcasts. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years with no breaks in the investigation, the story faded from public consciousness. Now, 26 years later, her name was little more than a footnote in a database of unsolved disappearances. Garrett stared at the suitcase, then back at his phone screen, at the grainy photograph of a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, smiling at the camera with an expression that suggested she had her whole life ahead of her. He felt suddenly intrusive, as though he had stumbled into a private moment that was never meant to be witnessed. But he also felt compelled to continue, to understand how this woman's belongings had ended up buried on his property, hundreds of miles from where she had last been seen. He found a pair of pliers and carefully worked the zipper free, the metal teeth grinding and protesting, but eventually giving way. The smell that emerged was earthy and damp, the scent of decades spent underground, but beneath it was something else, something faintly chemical that he could not identify. He opened the lid slowly, half afraid of what he might find inside. The contents were remarkably well preserved, protected by the suitcase's synthetic shell and the dry soil in which it had been buried. On top lay a stack of clothing, neatly folded, a pair of jeans, several t-shirts, a wool sweater. Beneath the clothing were books, their pages yellowed but still intact, textbooks on ecology and conservation biology, a worn paperback novel with a bookmark still tucked between the pages. There were toiletries in a clear plastic bag, a hairbrush with strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles, a tube of lipstick, a small bottle of perfume, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a towel, was a journal. Garrett lifted the journal carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The cover was plain brown leather, unmarked except for a small embossed flower in the corner. He opened it to the first page and saw a date written in the same neat handwriting as the tag. January 5th, 1998, nearly 10 months before Jessica Morrow disappeared. He began to read, standing there in his kitchen as the afternoon light faded and rain finally began to patter against the windows. The entries started mundane, documenting the daily life of a graduate student balancing coursework with teaching responsibilities and research obligations. Jessica wrote about her classes, her frustrations with her thesis advisor, her excitement over a field study she was planning in the coastal wetlands. She wrote about friends and family, about a sister who was getting married in the summer, about her mother's concerns that she was working too hard and not taking care of herself. The voice that emerged from the pages was thoughtful and earnest, someone who cared deeply about the natural world and saw her work as more than just academic pursuit. But as Garrett continued reading, moving through the winter months into spring, a subtle shift began to occur in the tone of the entries. Jessica began mentioning someone new, someone she referred to only as DAT. First, the references were casual, almost dismissive. D had approached her after a lecture she gave to an undergraduate class. D had shown up at the coffee shop where she studied on weekends. D seemed interested in her research, asked thoughtful questions, wanted to know more about her work in the wetlands. Jessica seemed flattered by the attention, though she also expressed some uncertainty. There was something intense about D, she wrote, something that made her feel both drawn in and slightly uneasy. By summer, the entries had taken on a different character. D was appearing more frequently, not just in Jessica's professional life but in her personal one as well. They had coffee together, went to see films, took long walks through the city. Jessica wrote that she enjoyed the company, that D was intelligent and well-read, and seemed to understand her in ways that others did not. But there were also moments of concern, small incidents that troubled her even as she tried to rationalize them away. D called too often, showed up at her apartment without invitation, became jealous when she spent time with friends. In one entry from late July, Jessica wrote that she had tried to create some distance, to suggest they see less of each other, and D had not taken it well. There had been an argument, raised voices, a scene in public that left her shaken and embarrassed. The entries became sporadic after that, sometimes skipping weeks at a time. When Jessica did write, she seemed distracted, anxious. She mentioned feeling watched, as though someone was following her. She had changed her phone number, had asked her department chair if she could relocate her office to a more secure building. She wrote that she was considering leaving the program entirely, transferring to a different university where D could not find her. But she also expressed doubt, wondering if she was overreacting, if she was letting fear control her decisions. The last entry was dated October 20th, 1998, 8 days before she was reported missing. In that final entry, Jessica wrote that she had made up her mind. She was leaving. She had accepted a position at a research station in the northern part of the state, a remote location where she could focus on her work without distraction or fear. She had already packed her belongings, had arranged for a friend to help her move the following week. She felt relieved, she wrote, as though a weight had been lifted. She felt like she was finally taking control of her life again. The entry ended with a single sentence. "Tomorrow I will tell D that I am leaving, and then this will all be over." Garrett closed the journal and set it down on the table, his hands trembling slightly. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the roof with a steady rhythm that filled the silence of the house. He looked at the suitcase, at the carefully packed belongings of a woman who had been planning a new beginning, and he understood with sudden clarity that she had never made it to that research station. Something had happened between that final journal entry and her disappearance 8 days later, something that had brought her and this suitcase to a property 200 miles away from where she had lived, to a place she had no known connection. He thought about the previous owner of the property, an elderly man named Harold Quincy, who had lived alone for the last 30 years of his life. Garrett had never met him, had only seen photographs in the estate documents, but neighbors had described him as reclusive and eccentric, someone who kept to himself and rarely ventured into town. Harold had purchased the property in the early 1990s, had built the farmhouse with his own hands, had lived there without electricity or running water for the first several years. Garrett wondered now if that timeline was significant, if there was a reason Harold Quincy had chosen such an isolated existence. He returned to his phone and searched for information about Harold Quincy, but there was little to find. An obituary from 3 months earlier, brief and impersonal. A few property records, nothing that suggested any connection to Jessica Morrow or to Millbrook, or to anything beyond the quiet, solitary life of a man who had wanted to be left alone. Garrett thought about calling the police, reporting what he had found, but something held him back. He wanted to understand first, to piece together the story before bringing in authorities who might seal everything away as evidence and leave him with nothing but questions. He went back to the suitcase and searched through the remaining contents more carefully, looking for anything he might have missed. Tucked into a side pocket, he found a small address book, the kind with alphabetical tabs, filled with names and phone numbers. Most of the entries meant nothing to him, but one name stood out, written under the letter D, Darren Wickham, followed by a phone number and an address in Millbrook. Garrett's pulse quickened. He wrote down the information, then continued his search. At the very bottom of the suitcase, beneath the towel that had wrapped the journal, he found something else. A photograph, slightly creased but otherwise undamaged. It showed Jessica standing with another person, both of them smiling at the camera, a lake visible in the background. The other person was a man, tall and lean with dark hair and sharp features. On the back of the photograph, in Jessica's handwriting, were 3 words and a date, D and me. June 1998. Garrett studied the photograph for a long time, committing the face to memory. Then he returned to his computer and began a new search, this time for Darren Wickham in Millbrook. What he found sent a cold wave of recognition through him. Darren Wickham had been interviewed by police during the initial investigation into Jessica's disappearance. He had been identified as an acquaintance, someone who had attended some of her lectures and occasionally met her for coffee. He had provided an alibi for the night she went missing, had claimed to be out of town visiting family. The police had found no reason to suspect him, and the investigation had moved in other directions. But there was something else in the records Garrett found, something buried in local news archives from several years later. In 2003, Darren Wickham had been arrested and convicted of stalking a different woman, a colleague at the software company where he worked. He had served 2 years in prison and been released in 2005. After that, the trail went cold. No known address, no employment records, nothing. Garrett sat back and tried to make sense of what he was learning. If Darren Wickham had been stalking Jessica in the months before her disappearance, if he had reacted badly when she tried to distance herself, if he had discovered her plan to leave and had decided to stop her, then the pieces began to fit together. But that still did not explain how her suitcase had ended up buried on this property, or what connection Wickham might have had to Harold Quincy. He decided to visit Millbrook, to see if he could find anyone who remembered Jessica or Wickham, anyone who might be able to fill in the gaps. The next morning before dawn, he loaded the suitcase and its contents carefully into his truck and began the long drive south. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the roads slick and the sky washed clean. As he drove, he thought about Jessica Morrow, about the life she had lived and the future she had been denied. He thought about her family, her sister who had gotten married that summer of 1998, her mother who had worried she was working too hard. They had spent 26 years not knowing what had happened, not knowing where she was, living with the terrible uncertainty that comes with an unsolved disappearance. Millbrook was smaller than Seattle, a town built around a river that had once powered lumber mills, but now served mainly as a scenic backdrop for the downtown district. Garrett parked his truck near the public library and went inside, asking the librarian if they kept old newspapers on file. She directed him to a basement archive, where bound volumes and microfiche reels were stored in neat rows. He spent hours going through papers from October and November of 1998, reading about Jessica's disappearance, the search efforts, the desperate pleas from her family for information. There were photographs of volunteers combing through wooded areas, of police officers holding press conferences, of Jessica's mother standing before a cluster of microphones with tears streaming down her face. He found the article about Darren Wickham's interview, a brief mention buried in a longer piece about the investigation. The reporter had described him as cooperative but nervous, someone who clearly cared about Jessica but who insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. There was a photograph accompanying the article, and Garrett recognized the face immediately. It was the same man from the photograph in the suitcase, though in the newspaper image he looked more guarded, his smile absent, his eyes avoiding the camera. As the afternoon wore on, Garrett left the library and began walking through the town, trying to get a sense of the place where Jessica had lived. He found her old apartment building, a 3-story structure near the university campus, and stood outside for a while, imagining her leaving that Thursday evening, walking down the front steps for the last time. He found the coffee shop she had mentioned in her journal, though it had changed ownership several times since and bore little resemblance to what it must have been. He walked until the light began to fade, until the street lamps flickered on and the town settled into evening quiet. He checked into a small motel on the edge of town and sat on the bed, surrounded by the contents of Jessica's suitcase, by the journal and the photograph and the address book. He opened the journal again and reread the last entry, that note of hope and determination, the belief that tomorrow would mark a new beginning. And he thought about the suitcase buried in the ground 200 miles away, hidden so carefully that it had taken 26 years for anyone to find it. Someone had wanted to make sure Jessica's belongings disappeared along with her, had wanted to erase the evidence of her plans and her fears. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one would ever know what happened on that October night in 1998. Garrett lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of traffic outside, feeling the weight of what he had discovered pressing down on him like a physical force. He knew that tomorrow he would have to contact the police, would have to turn over everything he had found and let them take over the investigation. But tonight, in this motel room in Millbrook, he felt connected to Jessica Morrow in a way he could not fully explain, as though by finding her suitcase he had become responsible for telling her story, for making sure that she was not forgotten again. The morning came too slowly, and when it did, Garrett found himself unable to move from the motel bed for several minutes, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles and listening to the hum of the heating unit beneath the window. The contents of Jessica's suitcase remained spread across the small desk in the corner, illuminated by the pale light filtering through the curtains. He had barely slept, his mind cycling through possibilities and questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve themselves. But lying there would accomplish nothing, and he knew what needed to happen next. He showered, dressed, and packed everything carefully back into the suitcase before loading it into his truck. The Millbrook Police Department was housed in a brick building near the center of town, unremarkable except for the flag hanging limply from a pole out front. Garrett parked and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, gathering his thoughts. Then he lifted the suitcase from the passenger seat and walked through the front doors into a small lobby that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. The officer at the front desk was young, probably no more than 25, and looked up from his computer screen with the practiced expression of someone accustomed to routine inquiries and minor complaints. But when Garrett explained why he was there, when he mentioned Jessica Morrow's name and placed the suitcase on the counter between them, the officer's expression shifted into something more alert, more uncertain. He excused himself and disappeared through a door behind the desk, returning a few minutes later with an older man in plainclothes, who introduced himself as Detective Raymond Lyle. Detective Lyle was in his late 50s, with gray hair cropped short and lines around his eyes that suggested decades of squinting at evidence and studying faces for signs of deception. He listened as Garrett recounted the story of finding the suitcase, his voice steady but his hands betraying his nervousness as they gestured to emphasize certain points. Lyle asked questions in a tone that was neither friendly nor hostile, simply thorough. Where exactly had the suitcase been buried? How deep? What condition was the soil? Had Garrett disturbed anything else at the site? Had he shown the contents to anyone else or posted about it online? Garrett answered everything as accurately as he could, and when he finished, Lyle stood silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from Garrett to the suitcase and back again. Then he asked Garrett to follow him to an interview room where they could speak more privately. The room was small and windowless, furnished with a table and 3 chairs, and it was there that Garrett opened the suitcase again and laid out the contents piece by piece, while Lyle watched with an intensity that made Garrett's skin prickle. The detective said nothing until Garrett showed him the journal, the address book, and the photograph of Jessica with Darren Wickham. Lyle picked up the photograph and studied it for what felt like a full minute before setting it down gently on the table. Then he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion or frustration, or perhaps both. He told Garrett that he remembered the Jessica Morrow case, that he had been a junior detective at the time and had worked on it alongside several senior investigators. It had been one of those cases that haunted everyone involved, he said, because there had been so little to go on. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no clear indication of what had happened or why. Jessica had simply vanished, and despite weeks of searches and hundreds of interviews, they had found nothing. They had looked at Darren Wickham, Lyle continued, had brought him in for questioning multiple times. Wickham had admitted to knowing Jessica, to having spent time with her, but he had maintained that they were just friends, that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. His alibi had checked out, at least on the surface. He claimed to have been visiting his parents in a town 3 hours away on the night Jessica was last seen, and his parents had confirmed it. The detectives had found no reason to disbelieve them, no evidence to suggest Wickham had been anywhere near Millbrook that night. And so the investigation had moved in other directions, chasing leads that went nowhere, following tips that turned out to be false or irrelevant. As months passed without a break, public interest waned. The media stopped covering the story, the volunteers stopped searching, and eventually the case was relegated to the cold files, one of dozens that accumulated over the years in departments across the country. Jessica's family had never stopped looking, Lyle said. Her mother had called the station every few months for years, asking if there was any news, if anyone was still working on it. But the truth was that, without new evidence, there was nothing more they could do. The case had grown cold not because anyone wanted it to, but because they had exhausted every avenue they could find. Now, Lyle said, looking at the suitcase and its contents spread across the table, they had something new, something that changed the entire picture. He asked Garrett if he would be willing to show them the exact location where the suitcase had been found, and Garrett agreed immediately. They would need to process the site, Lyle explained, bring in a forensic team to excavate the area properly, search for anything else that might have been buried there. It would take time, but it was necessary. And in the meantime, they would reopen the investigation into Jessica's disappearance, starting with a fresh look at Darren Wickham and anyone else who had been in her life at the time. Garrett spent the rest of that day with the police, riding in Detective Lyle's car back to Seattle and then out to his property, where he stood in the field and pointed to the spot where he had been digging. Within hours, the area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and a team of technicians in white coveralls began the painstaking work of sifting through the soil. Garrett watched from a distance, feeling both relief and unease. He had done what needed to be done, but he could not shake the sense that he had set something in motion that would uncover truths no one was prepared for. The excavation took 3 days. During that time, Garrett stayed away from the site, remaining inside his farmhouse while the team worked. Lyle called him periodically with updates, his voice carefully neutral. They had found nothing else in the immediate vicinity of where the suitcase had been buried, no additional items, no remains. The soil had been analyzed and determined to match the surrounding area, suggesting the suitcase had been placed there relatively soon after Jessica's disappearance, before significant weather patterns or erosion could alter the landscape. It was the kind of detail that would matter in court, Lyle said, if they ever got that far. But the real breakthrough came not from the excavation itself, but from the renewed investigation into Darren Wickham. Detectives began tracking his movements over the years since Jessica's disappearance, piecing together a timeline from employment records, address changes, court documents, and interviews with people who had known him. What emerged was a pattern that grew more troubling the further they dug. After his arrest and conviction for stalking in 2003, Wickham had moved frequently, never staying in one place for more than a year or two. He had worked a series of short-term jobs, mostly in warehouses or delivery services, positions that required little interaction with others and left few records. He had avoided social media, had no online presence, had seemed intent on disappearing into anonymity. In 2012, he had briefly resurfaced in public records when he purchased a vehicle, a used van from a dealership in a town called Ridgefield, about 30 miles from Millbrook. The purchase had been unremarkable at the time, but now it raised questions. Why Ridgefield? Why that particular vehicle? Detectives began looking into Wickham's activities during that period, searching for any connection to the area where Garrett's property was located. And they found one, tenuous but significant. Harold Quincy, the previous owner of Garrett's land, had worked for a logging company in the early 1990s, and one of his coworkers during that time had been a man named Thomas Wickham, Darren's uncle. The connection was circumstantial, but it provided a potential link. If Darren Wickham had known about the property through his uncle, if he had known it was remote and isolated and owned by someone who kept to himself, it would have been an ideal place to hide evidence. Detectives reached out to Thomas Wickham, now retired and living in a care facility, but he claimed to have no knowledge of his nephew's activities and said he had not spoken to Darren in over a decade. They contacted Harold Quincy's estate attorney, asking if there were any records of visitors to the property or any unusual activity in the months following Jessica's disappearance, but the attorney had nothing to offer. Harold had been a private man who kept few records and fewer friends. Still, the detectives pressed forward, focusing their efforts on locating Darren Wickham himself. His last known address had been in a city 2 states away, a small apartment he had rented for 6 months before disappearing again in 2018. Landlords, neighbors, former employers, all were contacted, all were questioned, but none could provide useful information. Wickham had been quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person who blended into the background and left no impression. It was as though he had spent the last 2 decades perfecting the art of not being noticed. While the investigation continued, Jessica's family was contacted and informed of the discovery. Detective Lyle made the call himself, speaking first to Jessica's mother, Margaret Morrow, who was now in her 70s and living in a retirement community near the coast. Lyle had spoken to her many times over the years, had watched her age under the weight of not knowing, and he approached the conversation with a mixture of hope and dread. He explained what had been found, where it had been found, and what it might mean. Margaret listened in silence, and when he finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady, and she asked only one question. Did this mean they were closer to knowing what happened to her daughter? Lyle told her the truth. They were closer, but they were not there yet. The suitcase proved that someone had taken Jessica's belongings and hidden them, which suggested something terrible had happened. But without finding Jessica herself, without locating Darren Wickham or uncovering additional evidence, they could not say for certain what that something was. Margaret thanked him, her voice breaking only slightly, and asked him to keep her informed of any developments. Then she hung up, and Lyle sat alone in his office for a long time, staring at the photograph of Jessica that he had pinned to the case board on his wall. Jessica's sister, Amanda, who had gotten married that summer of 1998, was also notified. She was living out of state now, a mother of 3 with a busy life that she had built in the years since her sister vanished. But the disappearance had never left her, had cast a shadow over every milestone and every moment of joy. When she heard about the suitcase, she broke down, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions that came with the news. She told the detective that she had always believed Jessica was gone, that something bad had happened, but having that belief confirmed in such a tangible way was almost unbearable. Still, she was grateful, she said. Grateful that someone had found the suitcase, grateful that the case was being reopened, grateful that there was a chance, however small, of finally getting answers. The news of the discovery leaked to the media within days, as such things always do, and soon Millbrook was flooded with reporters and camera crews, all eager to cover the story of the young woman who had disappeared 26 years earlier, and whose belongings had just been unearthed miles away from where she was last seen. The town, which had moved on in the decades since Jessica's disappearance, found itself thrust back into the past, forced to reckon with a tragedy it had tried to forget. Old residents were interviewed, their memories hazy and selective. The coffee shop where Jessica had once studied became a focal point for journalists, who filmed segments outside its front door, speculating about her final days. The apartment building where she had lived was photographed from every angle, its current residents annoyed by the intrusion, but also drawn to the morbid curiosity of it all. In Seattle, Garrett found himself at the center of unwanted attention. His name had been released to the press as the person who discovered the suitcase, and reporters showed up at his property, knocking on his door and calling his phone, asking for interviews and details. He declined them all, uncomfortable with the spotlight, and unsure what he could add to the story that was not already being told. But the attention did not fade quickly. True crime enthusiasts on the internet began dissecting every aspect of the case, creating timelines and theories, analyzing photographs and documents that had been made public. Some praised Garrett for bringing the case back into the light. Others accused him of tampering with evidence or fabricating the discovery for attention. The scrutiny was exhausting, and he began to regret ever picking up that shovel. Detective Lyle and his team, meanwhile, continued their work away from the cameras. They re-interviewed everyone who had been questioned during the original investigation, cross-referencing old statements with new information. They reached out to forensic experts, asking if modern technology could extract anything useful from the items in the suitcase. DNA, fingerprints, anything that might link Darren Wickham definitively to the scene. They combed through financial records, phone records, travel records, searching for any indication of where Wickham had been in October of 1998, any crack in the alibi that his parents had provided all those years ago. And then, 6 weeks after Garrett's discovery, they got a break. A woman named Eileen Granger, who had been a neighbor of the Wickham family in the late 90s, came forward after seeing the news coverage. She told detectives that she remembered Darren visiting his parents around the time Jessica disappeared, but she also remembered something that had struck her as odd at the time. She had seen Darren leaving his parents' house very late one night, well past midnight, driving away in his car with what looked like urgency. She had not thought much of it then, had assumed he was simply going out or heading back to wherever he was staying. But now, in light of the renewed investigation, the memory had resurfaced, and she felt compelled to share it. The timeline she described placed Darren Wickham leaving his parents' house in the early hours of the morning on what would have been October 21st, 1998. The same night Jessica was believed to have disappeared. If Eileen's memory was accurate, it meant Wickham's alibi was not as solid as it had seemed. It meant he could have driven back to Millbrook, could have confronted Jessica, could have done something that resulted in her disappearance and the burial of her suitcase. It was not proof, but it was enough to cast serious doubt on the story he had told police 26 years earlier. Detectives intensified their efforts to locate Wickham, issuing a public appeal for information and distributing his last known photograph to law enforcement agencies across multiple states. They examined his financial history more closely, looking for any transactions that might reveal his current whereabouts. And finally, 3 months after the suitcase was discovered, they got a hit. A man matching Wickham's description had been living under a different name in a small rural community in the northern part of the state, working as a handyman and renting a cabin on the outskirts of town. Local authorities were contacted, and a warrant was obtained. The arrest happened on a cold morning in late spring, officers approaching the cabin quietly and taking Wickham into custody without incident. He did not resist, did not ask questions, simply stood with his hands behind his back as the cuffs were applied, his face expressionless. When detectives arrived to transport him back to Millbrook, they searched the cabin and found it sparse and impersonal, the home of someone who had been living as though ready to leave at any moment. There were no photographs, no personal mementos, nothing that suggested a life rooted in that place or any other. During the interrogation that followed, Darren Wickham said very little. He acknowledged knowing Jessica, admitted to spending time with her, but denied any involvement in her disappearance. When confronted with Eileen Granger's testimony about seeing him leave his parents' house that night, he claimed she was mistaken, that he had been there all night and had not left until the following morning. When shown the suitcase and asked how it had ended up buried on property connected to his uncle's former co-worker, he said he had no idea, that he had never been to that property, that someone was trying to frame him. His denials were calm and measured, and his lawyer advised him to say nothing further, but the evidence was mounting. Forensic analysis of the suitcase had yielded fingerprints, faint but identifiable, that matched Darren Wickham's prints on file from his 2003 arrest. Soil samples from his old vehicle, which had been tracked down and impounded, contained trace elements consistent with the soil at Garrett's property. And a cadaver dog brought to the site weeks earlier had alerted at a spot approximately 20 yards from where the suitcase had been buried, indicating the possible presence of human remains. A second excavation was ordered, and this time, the team worked with even greater care, brushing away layers of earth with painstaking precision. On a gray afternoon in early summer, almost 4 months after Garrett first struck something hard with his shovel, the excavation team uncovered what they had been searching for. Bone fragments, partially decomposed fabric, and personal effects that matched the description of what Jessica Morrow had been wearing the night she disappeared. The medical examiner was called to the scene, and over the following days, the remains were carefully removed and transported to the lab for analysis. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew: Jessica Morrow had been found. The confirmation brought both closure and renewed grief to her family. Margaret Morrow released a statement through the police department, thanking everyone who had worked to find her daughter and expressing her hope that justice would finally be served. Amanda traveled to Millbrook with her husband and children, visiting the site where her sister had been found and standing in silence among the trees, tears streaming down her face. The media covered every moment, and the story that had begun with a buried suitcase now culminated in the image of a family finally able to mourn, finally able to lay their loved one to rest. Darren Wickham was formally charged with murder, and the case moved toward trial. The evidence was circumstantial but substantial: fingerprints, soil samples, the testimony of witnesses, and the location of Jessica's remains in a place tied to his family. Prosecutors built their case carefully, knowing that they would need to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Wickham's defense argued that the evidence was purely coincidental, that someone else could have planted the suitcase and moved Jessica's body, that the investigation was driven by desperation to close an old case rather than by solid proof. The trial, when it came, stretched over weeks, with both sides presenting expert witnesses and challenging every detail. The courtroom was filled each day with reporters, with members of Jessica's family, with people from Millbrook who had followed the case from the beginning. Garrett attended several days of the proceedings, sitting quietly in the back and watching as the story he had unearthed played out in testimony and evidence. He felt disconnected from it all, as though he were watching something that had happened to someone else, even though he knew his actions had set everything in motion. In the end, the jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a verdict: guilty. Darren Wickham showed no emotion as the word was read, simply stared straight ahead as though he were alone in the room. Sentencing came weeks later: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Margaret Morrow, too frail to attend the trial, watched the sentencing via video link from her home, and when it was over, she closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. Jessica Morrow was buried in a cemetery on the edge of Millbrook, beneath a tree that bloomed white flowers each spring. Her headstone was simple, bearing her name and the dates of her birth and death, along with a single line chosen by her family: she loved the world and tried to save it. The funeral was attended by hundreds, a mixture of family, friends, former classmates, and people who had never known her but who had been moved by her story. Garrett was there, standing at a distance, feeling the weight of everything that had happened since he first dug into that field. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The media moved on to other stories, the reporters left Millbrook, and the town settled back into its quiet routines. Garrett finished the work on his property, though he never returned to the spot where the suitcase had been buried. He sold the land the following year and moved to a different state, seeking a fresh start away from the shadow of what he had found. Detective Lyle retired not long after the trial, his career bookended by the case that had haunted him for more than 2 decades. He kept a photograph of Jessica on his desk at home, a reminder of why the work mattered, of why some cases could never be allowed to fade away. And in a way that no one could have predicted, Jessica's story lived on. Her journal was published with her family's permission, the proceeds going to a foundation established in her name to support young women pursuing careers in environmental science. The foundation awarded scholarships each year, ensuring that Jessica's passion for the natural world would continue through others who shared her vision. It was not the legacy she would have chosen, but it was something, a small light against the darkness of what had been taken from her. Years passed, and the case became part of history, one of those stories that people remembered when they thought about unsolved mysteries finally brought to resolution. But for those who had been closest to it, Margaret and Amanda, Detective Lyle, and even Garrett, it remained present in ways both painful and profound. They had learned that some truths take decades to surface, that justice can be slow and uncertain, but that it is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes. And they had learned that even in the darkest places, even in the soil where terrible secrets are buried, there is the possibility of light, of truth, of a story finally told. The verdict had been delivered, the sentence handed down, and yet Garrett found himself unable to leave the story behind as easily as others seemed to. In the weeks following the trial, he returned to his property only once, standing at the edge of the field where he had first struck earth and changed the course of so many lives. The excavation site had been filled in, the yellow tape removed, but he could still see the outline of it in his mind, could still remember the weight of that suitcase in his hands and the certainty that had washed over him when he first read Jessica's name on the faded luggage tag. He had thought, naively perhaps, that finding answers would bring a sense of completion, that justice served would equal peace restored. But standing there in the quiet of early morning, watching mist rise from the ground where Jessica had lain hidden for more than 2 decades, he understood that closure was not a destination but a process, one that would continue long after he left this place. The land itself seemed different now, marked by what had been uncovered, and he knew he could not continue living here with that knowledge pressing down on him every time he looked out his window. The decision to sell came easily after that. He listed the property through a local realtor who knew the history but agreed to market it discreetly, focusing on the potential of the land rather than its past. It sold within 2 months to a couple who planned to establish a small organic farm, people who seemed undeterred by what had happened there, and who spoke hopefully about new beginnings. Garrett signed the papers in a conference room that smelled of printer toner and stale coffee, and as he walked out into the afternoon sunlight, he felt both relief and a strange sense of betrayal, as though he were abandoning something unfinished. Before he left Seattle entirely, he visited the cemetery where Jessica had been laid to rest. It was a clear day, the kind of autumn afternoon when the light turns everything golden and the air carries the scent of leaves and earth. He had not attended the funeral itself, feeling that his presence would be intrusive, but he wanted to pay his respects privately, to acknowledge in some tangible way the connection he felt to this woman he had never known but whose story had become intertwined with his own. Her grave was easy to find, marked by fresh flowers that her family had left during a recent visit. The headstone was simple and elegant, the inscription exactly as he had read about in the news coverage. He stood before it for a long time, hands in his pockets, searching for words that felt adequate. Finally, he spoke aloud, his voice quiet but steady. He told her he was sorry for what had happened to her, sorry that her life had been cut short by someone who could not accept her choices. He told her that he hoped she had found peace, wherever she was, and that her family could now begin to heal. And he promised that he would not forget her, that her story would remain with him as a reminder of why truth mattered, why justice mattered, even when it came too late to undo the harm. As he turned to leave, he noticed someone else approaching along the path between the graves. It was a woman in her 40s, dressed simply in jeans and a dark sweater, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. She looked up as she drew near, and recognition passed between them without words. Garrett realized who she must be even before she introduced herself. Amanda, Jessica's sister. They stood together in awkward silence for a moment before Amanda spoke, thanking him for coming, for everything he had done. Garrett shook his head and told her he had only been doing what anyone would have done, But she disagreed gently. Most people would have called the police immediately, she said, would have handed everything over without question. But he had taken the time to understand Jessica's story, to read her words and see her as a person rather than just evidence in a case. That mattered to the family, she said. It mattered more than he might realize. They talked for a while longer, standing beside Jessica's grave as the afternoon light shifted and softened around them. Amanda told him about her sister, about the person she had been before the journal entries and the news reports, before she became a victim. She spoke about Jessica's laugh, which had been loud and unrestrained, about her stubbornness when she believed in something, about the way she could spend hours watching birds in the backyard and never grow bored. She told Garrett about the last time they had spoken, a phone conversation a week before Jessica disappeared, during which Jessica had sounded tired but hopeful, talking about the research position she was planning to accept and the fresh start it represented. Amanda's voice broke when she described receiving the call from police all those years ago, the call that shattered her family and left them suspended in a nightmare that had no clear ending. She spoke about her mother's decline, the way Margaret had aged rapidly under the weight of not knowing, how every holiday and birthday had been haunted by Jessica's absence. And she spoke about her own guilt, the irrational but persistent feeling that she should have done something, should have known something was wrong, should have protected her little sister somehow. Garrett listened without interrupting, recognizing that Amanda needed to say these things aloud, needed to share the burden she had carried for so long. When she finished, he told her gently that none of what happened was her fault, that the only person responsible was the one now serving a life sentence. Amanda nodded, tears streaming down her face, and thanked him again. Then she placed the wildflowers at the base of Jessica's headstone, touched the cold granite with her fingertips, and walked away down the path without looking back. Garrett remained a few minutes longer, watching the flowers move slightly in the breeze, thinking about the lives that had been irrevocably changed by one man's inability to let go, by one night of violence that rippled forward through time and touched people who would never meet Jessica Morrow, but who would carry her story with them nonetheless. He left Seattle the following week, moving to a small town in the mountains where no one knew his name or his connection to the case. He found work as a carpenter, a trade he had learned from his father, and which allowed him to create something tangible and useful with his hands. The work was meditative, requiring focus and precision, and it helped quiet the thoughts that still circled through his mind late at night when sleep would not come. He lived simply, renting a cabin near a river where he could fish and hike and lose himself in the rhythms of a life unconnected to tragedy. But he could not entirely escape the case, nor did he truly want to. The publication of Jessica's journal brought renewed attention, and though Garrett had declined all interviews and refused to profit from his involvement, he purchased a copy and read it in its entirety. The published version included annotations and an introduction written by Amanda, providing context for Jessica's entries and explaining how the journal had been found. It also included photographs, images of Jessica at various ages, smiling and vibrant and so achingly young. Reading the journal in its complete form, rather than in fragments spread across his kitchen table, Garrett gained a fuller understanding of who Jessica had been. She wrote about her dreams and fears with equal honesty, about the frustration of navigating academia as a young woman in a male-dominated field, about the joy she found in small moments of discovery in the natural world. She wrote about her relationship with her family, the closeness she shared with Amanda despite their different personalities, the love she felt for her mother even when Margaret's worrying became overwhelming. And she wrote about her hopes for the future, about the conservation work she wanted to do, about the belief that individual actions could make a difference in preserving the planet for future generations. The entries about Darren Wickham were more difficult to read, knowing how the story ended. Garrett could see the progression clearly now. The way Jessica's initial openness had given way to unease. The way she had tried to be kind even as she set boundaries. The way those boundaries had been ignored and violated. He could see her trying to rationalize Wickham's behavior, to give him the benefit of the doubt, to avoid confrontation. And he could see her fear growing as she realized that her attempts to distance herself were not working, that Wickham was not going to accept her decision to end their friendship. The final entries were particularly haunting, filled with a determination to reclaim her life, but also a palpable anxiety about how Wickham would react to her leaving. She had been right to be afraid, Garrett thought, and the injustice of that burned through him. She had done nothing wrong, had made no mistakes except perhaps being too kind to someone who interpreted kindness as encouragement, and she had paid for that perceived transgression with her life. The foundation established in Jessica's name grew steadily in the years following the trial. Funded by proceeds from the journal sales as well as donations from people moved by her story, it awarded scholarships annually to young women pursuing degrees in environmental science, ecology, or conservation biology. The recipients were chosen not only for their academic achievements, but also for their demonstrated passion for protecting the natural world, the same passion that had driven Jessica throughout her brief life. Amanda became deeply involved in the foundation's work, serving on its board and speaking at events about her sister's legacy. She often mentioned Garrett in her talks, describing how his discovery had not only brought Jessica home, but had also ensured that her voice would continue to be heard through the students who benefited from the scholarships. Garrett, watching recordings of these speeches online late at night in his mountain cabin, felt both honored and uncomfortable with the attention. But he understood that Amanda needed to construct meaning from the tragedy, needed to believe that something good could come from something so terrible. Detective Raymond Lyle's retirement had been announced shortly after the trial concluded, though he admitted in a brief interview that the case had hastened his decision. He had given 3 decades to law enforcement, had worked hundreds of cases, but the Jessica Morrow investigation was the one that had defined his career, both in its initial failure and its eventual resolution. In retirement, he volunteered with organizations that supported families of missing persons, offering guidance and perspective from someone who understood the unique anguish of living with uncertainty. He never spoke publicly about the specifics of the case, respecting the privacy of Jessica's family, but those who worked with him knew that he carried photographs of all his unsolved cases in a folder he reviewed regularly, as though maintaining a vigil for those who remained lost. Margaret Morrow lived long enough to see her daughter buried properly and her killer convicted, but she passed away less than a year after the trial ended. Her health, which had been declining for some time, seemed to give out once the purpose that had sustained her, seeking justice for Jessica, was fulfilled. Amanda, in a eulogy delivered at a small private service, spoke of her mother's strength and resilience, of how Margaret had never stopped believing that the truth would eventually surface. She spoke of how her mother had visited Jessica's grave every week during those final months, bringing flowers and speaking to her daughter as though she were still alive, telling her about family news and memories from Jessica's childhood. And she spoke of how, in the end, Margaret had died peacefully, having found the closure that had eluded her for 26 years. The town of Millbrook, which had been thrust back into the spotlight by the case, gradually returned to its ordinary rhythms. The coffee shop where Jessica had studied placed a small plaque in her memory, a simple brass marker noting that she had been a patron who cared deeply about the environment and encouraging customers to consider their own impact on the world. The university, where she had been a graduate student, established an annual lecture series in her name, bringing in prominent scientists and conservationists to speak about their work. These gestures were small, but they ensured that Jessica would not be forgotten by the community where she had lived and dreamed and ultimately been taken. Darren Wickham, serving his life sentence in a maximum security facility, maintained his innocence for several years after his conviction. He granted one interview to a journalist writing a book about the case, during which he claimed that he had been railroaded by an investigation desperate to close an old case, that the evidence against him had been circumstantial and manipulated. But his arguments convinced no one, and even his own family distanced themselves from him. His parents, who had provided the alibi that fell apart under scrutiny, released a statement expressing their sorrow for Jessica's family and their shame at having protected their son. They had believed him at the time, they said, had wanted to believe him, but they could no longer deny the truth. The statement was brief and understated, but it represented a significant fracture in the narrative Wickham had tried to maintain. As years passed, Wickham stopped granting interviews and retreated into silence. Reports from those who worked at the facility described him as withdrawn and isolated, someone who kept to himself and avoided interaction with other inmates. Whether he felt remorse or simply recognized the futility of continuing his denials remained unclear, but the silence itself spoke volumes. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the world outside would move forward without him. Garrett, living his quiet life in the mountains, found himself thinking less about the case as time went on, though it never entirely left him. He dated occasionally, built friendships with people who knew nothing of his past, and slowly constructed a life that felt authentically his own rather than defined by a single discovery. But there were moments when the memory would surface unexpectedly, seeing a suitcase at a thrift store, hearing a news report about a missing person, watching the rain fall on freshly turned earth, and he would pause, transported back to that morning when he first struck something hard beneath the soil. He thought often about the choices that had led to that moment, the series of coincidences and decisions that had placed him on that property at that particular time. If the land had sold to someone else, if he had chosen to hire help rather than clear the field himself, if he had been digging a few feet to the left or right, the suitcase might have remained hidden indefinitely. Jessica's family would have lived the rest of their lives without knowing what happened, without closure, without justice. The randomness of it troubled him sometimes, the realization that so much depended on chance, on being in the right place at the right time or, in Jessica's case, the wrong place at the wrong time. But he also came to accept that his role in the story had been meaningful precisely because it was unplanned. He had not been seeking to be a hero or to insert himself into a tragedy. He had simply been a man clearing land who had found something that did not belong there and had chosen to do the right thing. In a world that often felt chaotic and unjust, that small act of integrity had mattered. It had brought a family peace, had put a killer behind bars, had ensured that a young woman's voice continued to speak through her journal and through the foundation bearing her name. 5 years after finding the suitcase, Garrett received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a letter from Amanda, handwritten on simple stationery. She apologized for reaching out unexpectedly, explaining that she had tracked him down through the police department and hoped he would not mind the intrusion. She wrote that she was attending an event for the foundation in a city not far from where he now lived and wondered if he would be willing to meet for coffee. She understood if he preferred not to, she said, but she wanted to thank him in person and to let him know how much his actions had meant to her family. Garrett almost declined. He had worked hard to build distance from the case, to establish a life separate from that chapter. But something in Amanda's letter moved him, a vulnerability and sincerity that felt genuine. He responded with his phone number, and they arranged to meet at a small cafe in the downtown area of the city where her event was being held. When he arrived, Amanda was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. She looked older than she had at the cemetery, her hair now streaked with gray, but her smile was warm and welcoming. They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing easily despite the gravity of what connected them. Amanda told him about her children, now teenagers, and how she had explained Jessica's story to them in terms they could understand. She spoke about the foundation's work, about the students whose lives had been changed by the scholarships, about how receiving letters from those young women reminded her that Jessica's passion had not died with her. Garrett shared pieces of his own life, the work he was doing, the contentment he had found in simplicity and solitude. He admitted that he still thought about the case sometimes, still wondered if he could have done things differently, though he knew such thoughts were pointless. Amanda reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture both comforting and grounding. She told him that he had done more than he realized, that he had given her family something they had thought was lost forever. She told him that her mother had died at peace because of him, that she herself could now think of Jessica without the constant weight of not knowing. And she told him that he should not carry guilt or doubt, that what he had done was an act of grace in a world that desperately needed more of it. When they parted, Amanda hugged him tightly, thanking him one final time before disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians moving along the sidewalk. Garrett stood watching her go, feeling something shift inside him, a loosening of tension he had not fully recognized he was carrying. He walked back to his truck slowly, taking in the sights and sounds of the city around him, feeling more connected to the world than he had in a long time. The years continued to unfold, each one carrying its own challenges and moments of beauty. Garrett grew older, his hands becoming calloused from work, his face weathered by sun and wind. He never married, never had children, but he did not feel his life was lacking. He had friends who valued him, work that satisfied him, and a sense of having contributed something meaningful to the world, however accidentally. On the anniversary of finding the suitcase, he developed a private ritual. He would drive to a quiet place in the mountains, somewhere with a view of distant peaks and wide sky, and he would sit in silence for an hour. He did not pray exactly, not being a religious man, but he would think about Jessica Morrow and the life she might have lived. He would think about the students benefiting from the foundation, about Amanda and her family, about all the people touched by a tragedy that had finally been brought into the light. And he would think about the fragility of existence, how quickly everything could change, how important it was to recognize and honor the moments when one had the power to make a difference. The story eventually faded from public consciousness, as all stories do, replaced by newer tragedies and mysteries. But for those who had lived through it, who had been changed by it, the memory remained vivid and present. Jessica's journal continued to be read by new generations of students and advocates. The foundation continued its work, expanding its reach and impact. And in a quiet mountain town, a man who had once found a buried suitcase continued living his life with the knowledge that sometimes, even in the darkest soil, truth can take root and grow into something that transcends the original tragedy, something that speaks to resilience and hope, and the enduring power of one person's voice to echo across time. The land where Jessica had been found was eventually purchased by a conservation trust, transformed into a protected natural area where native plants were restored and wildlife could thrive. It was not designated as a memorial in any official capacity, but those who knew the history understood the significance. It was a place where something terrible had happened, yes, but also a place where truth had finally emerged, where justice had been possible because someone had cared enough to listen to a story told through objects and words left behind. And on certain mornings, when the light hit the field just right and the air carried that particular stillness that comes before dawn, one could almost imagine a young woman walking there, free from fear and full of purpose, continuing the work she had loved, the work that others now carried forward in her name. It was not the ending Jessica Morrow deserved, not the life she should have lived, but it was something. In a world where so many stories go unfinished, where so many voices fall silent without ever being heard again, it was a testament to the possibility that even the deepest secrets cannot remain buried forever, that truth has a way of finding the light, and that love and memory can persist long after loss, shaping the future in ways both small and profound.